Today, we're going to talk about something profoundly powerful, not magic, not pseudoscience, but a principle deeply rooted in how your brain, nervous system, and subconscious mind interact with the world. The title of today's talk is Speak This 100 Times and Watch Fate Align in Your Favor. Now, that might sound mystical, but I want to be very clear what we're about to explore has real scientific backing. When you speak certain phrases, especially with repetition and emotional engagement, you're not just saying words, you're literally reshaping the neural circuits of your brain. You're activating parts of the prefrontal cortex associated with decision-making, attention, and planning. You're engaging the autonomic nervous system, shifting your internal state toward clarity, motivation, and action. And most importantly, you're influencing the reticular activating system, the part of your brain that filters information and helps you notice opportunities aligned with your goals. What we say to ourselves repeatedly wires our identity, our habits, and ultimately the trajectory of our lives. So today, we're not just going to talk about saying something 100 times. We're going to explore why it works, how to do it correctly, and what kind of transformation you can expect when you take control of your internal narrative and use it as a tool to align your biology with your destiny. Repetition is not just a passive act of saying something over and over again. It is one of the most effective tools for rewiring the brain through a phenomenon known as self-directed neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt in response to experience, learning, and behavior. What many people don't realize is that this change is not arbitrary. It follows the direction of our focus and our intention. When we repeatedly say something, especially with emotion and deliberate attention, we are instructing our brain to strengthen specific neural pathways associated with those thoughts, beliefs, and internal narratives. These strengthened pathways form the bedrock of our self-perception, the lens through which we interpret the world, and the framework that guides our actions. Inside the brain, neurons that fire together wire together. This principle, popularized by neuroscientist Donald Hebb, describes how repeated activations between neurons create stronger synaptic connections. So, when you repeat a phrase, let's say something like, "I am aligned with my highest purpose," or "opportunities flow toward me," you are not just engaging in motivational talk. You are actively reinforcing a circuit in your brain. Over time, this circuit becomes more dominant, more readily accessed, and more influential in shaping how you think, feel, and behave. This is what's meant by self-directed neuroplasticity. You are choosing with intention which networks to strengthen and which to allow to fade through disuse. This kind of repetition has implications beyond simple belief reinforcement. When a phrase is repeated regularly, it begins to shape not only what we believe, but who we believe we are. That distinction is critical. If you repeatedly say, "I am confident," you're not just trying to feel confident, you're training your identity system to accept confidence as a baseline trait. Over time, your brain starts to reduce the dissonance between who you are and who you say you are by adapting your perception and behavior to match the repeated self-definition. This is where repetition begins to shape identity. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-referential thought, is especially active during internal dialogue and self-description. Repeated use of affirming or intentional language increases activity in this area and strengthens associations between the words and your self-concept. On a neurochemical level, repetition also helps modulate emotional states. The act of speaking certain words repeatedly, especially when those words are emotionally resonant or aspirational, activates dopamine circuits in the brain. Dopamine, often associated with motivation and reward, is deeply involved in habit formation and reinforcement. When we repeat something that feels good or empowering, dopamine release signals the brain to keep doing it. This is how affirmations, when repeated with emotional intensity, can begin to feel rewarding in themselves, creating a feedback loop where the brain seeks more of that pattern, thus reinforcing the underlying belief even further. The brain's plasticity is highest during moments of heightened attention and emotional arousal. This means that simply repeating words in a mechanical or distracted way won't yield the same effects as saying them with presence, emotion, and focus. The more emotionally charged the repetition, the more strongly the synaptic connections form. This is due in part to the involvement of the amygdala, which tags emotionally significant experiences for stronger memory encoding. So repetition works best when it is deliberate, emotionally meaningful, and connected to a clear internal intention. The timing and consistency of repetition matter. The brain loves rhythm and predictability. When you repeat a phrase consistently, say 100 times each morning or evening, you create a rhythmic pattern that the brain can latch onto. Over time, this routine becomes automatic, shifting from a conscious effort to an ingrained habit. At that point, the new belief or thought pattern starts to operate in the background, influencing decisions, reactions, and even the way you interpret events. You no longer have to try to think positively or feel aligned, you simply do, because your identity has shifted through repetition. The process is very similar to learning a motor skill. Just as a musician practices a chord progression until it becomes second nature, or a basketball player shoots hundreds of free throws to lock in muscle memory, repetition of words trains the mental muscle memory of belief and identity. The more frequently you engage in this type of verbal repetition, the more fluent and automatic your inner dialogue becomes. This automaticity is crucial because most of our daily behaviors and thoughts are governed by unconscious habits, not conscious decisions. If you can embed intentional, empowering language into those unconscious routines, you begin to shift your baseline mindset and behavior from the ground up. Even the tone and posture during repetition can influence the outcome. Standing upright, breathing deeply, and speaking with conviction sends somatic signals to the brain that reinforce the emotional weight of the words. These somatic markers, stored by the insular cortex, help encode the experience as meaningful, making the repetition more impactful on a neural level. So, when you speak something 100 times, you are doing far more than engaging in verbal exercise. You are using language, emotion, posture, and neurobiology to deliberately alter the structure and function of your brain. The reticular activating system, or RAS, is a network of neurons located in the brainstem that plays a crucial role in regulating wakefulness, attention, and what we become consciously aware of. One of its most fascinating functions is filtering the massive amount of sensory data our brain receives at any given moment. The human brain is bombarded with millions of bits of information per second, but only a tiny fraction makes it into our conscious awareness. The RAS is what determines what passes through that filter. What most people don't realize is that we can train the RAS to tune our perception based on what we consistently think, say, or believe. In other words, what we repeatedly focus on, especially through intentional, repeated speech, can train the RAS to seek out and prioritize information that aligns with those thoughts. When you speak a phrase 100 times a day, you are not just reinforcing it in your conscious mind. You are sending a clear signal to your RAS. This is important. Pay attention to anything related to this. Over time, your RAS adjusts its filtering criteria to prioritize opportunities, people, patterns, and information that align with the repeated phrase. For example, if you begin repeating, "I am attracting new opportunities," your RAS will start highlighting cues in your environment that support that idea, perhaps an overlooked email, a conversation you would normally ignore, or a connection you might otherwise dismiss. It's not that these things weren't there before, it's that your brain wasn't trained to notice them. This tuning effect is similar to what happens when you buy a new car and suddenly start seeing that same car model everywhere. The car didn't suddenly become more popular overnight. Your brain simply assigned that model as relevant, and your RAS started allowing related sensory input through to your conscious mind. This is the same mechanism that kicks in when you repeat a phrase like a mantra with consistency and emotional intent. You're programming your brain to elevate anything connected to the repeated idea into the spotlight of awareness. This has profound implications for how we experience life. The RAS doesn't distinguish between what is real and what is imagined. It simply prioritizes what has been emotionally and cognitively marked as important. So if someone is constantly saying negative things to themselves, like "nothing ever works out for me," the RAS will look for evidence to support that belief and ignore contradictory information. On the other hand, if someone speaks affirming and empowering language, the RAS will begin scanning the environment for proof that the world supports that outlook. This is not wishful thinking, it's selective perception driven by neurological systems designed to help us function in a complex and chaotic world. Another way the RAS can be influenced is through goals and visualization. When a person sets a goal and repeats it often, the RAS treats that goal as a filter. It begins aligning incoming data to support the achievement of that goal. Athletes, entrepreneurs, and high performers often use this system, sometimes without even realizing it, by affirming their goals out loud, visualizing their outcomes, and focusing on what they want to achieve. The verbal repetition helps keep the goal top of mind, and the RAS helps them notice and act on opportunities to bring it to life. The RAS works closely with the limbic system, which is responsible for emotion and motivation. When you repeat something with conviction and emotional intensity, it registers more strongly in your RAS, making it more likely that your attention and behavior will be influenced by that input. The more emotionally invested you are in what you're saying, the more your brain tags it as important, and the more likely it becomes that your conscious mind will align with that belief. This is why flat or monotone affirmations tend to fall flat. The brain doesn't mark them as meaningful, and the RAS doesn't recalibrate its filters. The power of repeated speech is not just in the words themselves, but in the frequency and intensity of the signal you're sending to your brain. Saying something once is a whisper to your RAS. Saying it 100 times is like raising the volume on that signal until the brain can no longer ignore it. Over time, this repetition shapes your internal world and, through the RAS, alters how you experience the external world. Your perceptions begin to change, not because the world changed, but because you have trained your mind to focus on what aligns with the reality you are choosing to build. When people talk about manifesting something or attracting a new outcome, what they're often tapping into, whether they realize it or not, is the selective tuning mechanism of the RAS. It's a scientifically grounded process that begins with intention, is amplified by repetition, and results in a reorientation of how you interpret, notice, and act upon the opportunities that surround you. Verbal affirmations, when spoken with repetition and emotional engagement, have a direct influence on key neurochemical systems in the brain, particularly those involving dopamine and norepinephrine. These two neurotransmitters play crucial roles in regulating motivation, attention, energy levels, and mood. When you speak an affirmation with intention, especially one that reflects a desired identity or future state, you stimulate the neural circuits involved in anticipation, reward prediction, and behavioral drive. This activation creates a biochemical cascade that can enhance focus, increase goal-directed behavior, and reinforce positive emotional states, which together make you more likely to take actions aligned with your verbalized intention. Dopamine, often referred to as the motivation molecule, is not just released in response to external rewards. It is also released in anticipation of a reward or as a result of mentally simulating a desired outcome. When you speak a phrase like "I am making powerful progress every day," your brain can interpret that as a mini goal being achieved or visualized. The repetition reinforces the idea, and the idea triggers a dopamine release that enhances your drive and readiness to act. This process turns the act of speaking into a neurological rehearsal for success, and the dopamine reinforces the behavior, making you more likely to continue it. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, is associated with alertness, attention, and energy mobilization. It heightens your awareness and enhances cognitive performance under stress or demand. When you pair spoken affirmations with enthusiasm or conviction, your brain releases norepinephrine, sharpening your mental focus and making you more sensitive to relevant cues in your environment. This chemical shift creates a feedback loop. Your words trigger emotional intensity, which triggers norepinephrine release, which then amplifies the emotional and cognitive salience of the words you're speaking. That's why affirmations delivered with strong emotion feel more real and impactful. They're chemically reinforced in the brain. These neurochemical systems also work together in shaping the brain's reward circuitry. The brain learns to associate certain behaviors with internal rewards, and when those behaviors are repeated, like affirming a belief or speaking about your goals, the associated neurotransmitter activity creates a kind of emotional imprint. Over time, your brain comes to anticipate and crave the feeling of alignment and empowerment that comes from speaking affirming language. This is how verbal repetition can transition from a conscious practice to a deeply ingrained habit. It's not just mental, it's physiological. The brain and body begin to expect that biochemical response, and the behavior becomes self-reinforcing. This also explains why certain affirmations can feel more energizing than others. When a phrase aligns closely with your goals, values, or an emotionally meaningful outcome, your brain reacts more strongly. This is due to how tightly dopamine is linked to subjective value and perceived relevance. An affirmation like "I am becoming the kind of person who can handle anything" may have more neurochemical impact than a generic phrase like "I am happy," because it reflects a meaningful challenge and a vision of personal growth. The more specific and emotionally resonant the statement, the more likely it is to engage the brain's reward pathways and release the chemicals that drive focus, energy, and action. Another important factor is the timing of repetition. Morning and evening are particularly powerful windows because the brain is in a more suggestible state due to naturally lower cortical inhibition and shifts in neurochemical levels. In the early morning, dopamine levels are rising, and the mind is beginning to orient itself to the day ahead. Repeating affirmations during this time can help set a motivational tone and prime the brain for goal-directed action. In the evening, the mind is more reflective and less distracted by external input, which allows deeper encoding of repeated thoughts into long-term memory. Combining repetition with deliberate breathing, visualization, or physical motion during these times can further amplify the neurochemical effects. Importantly, this process is not about tricking the brain or creating false beliefs. It is about aligning your language with your highest values and desired future, and then using the body's own neurochemical systems to reinforce that alignment. Just as exercise strengthens the body by consistently signaling the muscles to grow, verbal affirmations strengthen motivational systems in the brain by signaling them to activate repeatedly around a chosen direction. Over time, this builds a kind of psychological momentum, a forward drive powered by biology and choice. When verbal affirmations are spoken 100 times, the cumulative neurochemical effect is significant. Each repetition adds a small amount of reinforcement. Each moment of belief adds fuel to the dopamine system. Each surge of energy from norepinephrine enhances the perceived importance of what's being said. Repeating with intensity day after day is like training the brain to turn those words into action-oriented states. The chemicals released in this process not only help focus your mind, they also begin to shift how you see yourself, what you expect from the world, and how you respond to opportunity and challenge. Spoken language is one of the most powerful tools available to the human brain, not only for communication, but for shaping internal states and influencing the nervous system. When we speak with intention, we activate multiple systems at once: the cognitive networks that process meaning and expectation, and the somatic systems that influence our physiology. The integration of these systems means that the simple act of speaking can initiate deep changes across both mind and body. This is not metaphorical. From a neuroscientific perspective, every word you speak sends electrical and chemical signals through specific brain regions, activates motor pathways, and creates feedback loops that alter emotional states, physical tension, posture, breathing, and ultimately behavior. When you speak a sentence like "I am capable," you are engaging Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the brain, which are involved in the production and comprehension of language. But those are just the entry points. Speaking aloud also activates the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for goal setting, future planning, and conscious thought. This engagement sends a clear signal to the rest of the brain: this message is important. This is what we want to align with. Simultaneously, the auditory system processes the sound of your own voice, sending sensory feedback into the brain that reinforces the message. This loop between thought, speech, and hearing creates a closed circuit that strengthens the associated neural pathways, especially when the message is repeated consistently and with emotion. The somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary muscle movement, is also engaged during speech. When you speak out loud, you are using breath control, vocal cords, diaphragm, facial muscles, and postural support. This means that each spoken word is not just mental, it is a full-body event. The way you carry yourself while speaking, the tone of voice you use, and the rhythm of your delivery all feed back into the brain through proprioceptive and interoceptive signals. This feedback can amplify or diminish the emotional impact of what you're saying. Standing tall and speaking with conviction sends signals through the spinal cord and vagus nerve that the body is in a confident, empowered state. This in turn influences the brain's interpretation of the message and reinforces the emotional weight of the words. The autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches, is also influenced by spoken language. When you say something calming and affirming, you may notice your breathing slow and your muscles relax. This is the parasympathetic system being activated. On the other hand, when you speak with intensity and purpose, your heart rate may quicken slightly and your energy may rise. This is mild sympathetic arousal, which is not a stress response but a readiness state. Repeated speech acts can train your body to enter these states more quickly and reliably. If you associate certain affirmations with calm or focus, your nervous system begins to respond predictably each time you repeat them. This is the foundation of somatic conditioning, where the body learns to associate words with states of being. Over time, this kind of conditioning becomes deeply embedded. your nervous system begins to link certain spoken phrases with specific physiological and emotional responses. This is similar to how elite athletes use pre-performance routines, including specific verbal cues, to trigger optimal performance states. By speaking a phrase that has been practiced repeatedly in a state of focus, the athlete is not just saying words, they are activating an entire internal pattern of readiness and excellence. You can use this same mechanism to anchor emotional states to specific affirmations through repetition and association. The more often you repeat a phrase in a particular state, the stronger the neural and physiological link becomes, allowing you to shift into that state more quickly with each repetition. Another aspect of speech that influences the nervous system is the emotional resonance of the words you use. Emotionally charged words activate the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus, which are involved in emotional processing and memory. The more emotionally meaningful the language, the more likely it is to be encoded deeply into memory and to trigger powerful physiological responses. This is why it's important to choose affirmations that carry real meaning for you, phrases that make you feel something when you say them. Generic or hollow affirmations may not engage the nervous system in the same way, and therefore may not produce the same level of change. The brain does not interpret language in isolation. It takes into account tone, inflection, volume, and body language. When you say something 100 times with consistency, you are sending a message to every layer of your nervous system. This is the direction we are going. This is the identity we are strengthening. This is the emotional state we are choosing to reinforce. Each repetition, especially when paired with full vocal expression and emotional engagement, deepens the imprint of that message in both brain and body. The nervous system, over time, begins to internalize the rhythm, tone, and meaning of the spoken words as a template for how to feel, act, and perceive. Through this integration of spoken language with cognitive and somatic systems, repetition becomes a full-spectrum training tool for aligning your internal state with the future you are creating. Repetition is a fundamental principle through which the brain learns, encodes, and reinforces patterns. From early childhood language acquisition to advanced skill development in adulthood, repeated exposure to a stimulus strengthens the neural pathways associated with that stimulus. In the context of spoken language, repetition turns fleeting thoughts into enduring beliefs. Every time a phrase is spoken, neurons in the brain fire in a specific sequence. When the same sequence is triggered repeatedly, those neurons begin to wire together more strongly, a concept known in neuroscience as Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. This repeated firing enhances the speed, efficiency, and dominance of the associated neural circuits, making the thought or phrase easier to access, more likely to surface automatically, and more influential in shaping perception and behavior. The brain's ability to adapt through repetition is part of its neuroplasticity, its lifelong capacity to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. When you speak a statement 100 times a day, you are leveraging this adaptability to sculpt your internal dialogue and cognitive orientation. Initially, the statement might feel unfamiliar or even untrue, but with enough repetition, the brain starts to normalize it. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in logic and conscious decision-making, begins to integrate the statement as part of its operating framework. Simultaneously, deeper brain structures, such as the basal ganglia, which help regulate habits and automatic behaviors, start to adopt the repetition as a new default. Over time, what once required effort to say becomes a habitual way of thinking, embedded in both conscious reasoning and subconscious processing. This process is amplified by the brain's pattern-seeking nature. The brain is constantly trying to predict what's coming next based on past input. When you repeatedly say a phrase like "I attract success," your brain starts to expect success-oriented outcomes. It begins to create a kind of predictive model, anticipating that future experiences will match the repeated verbal input. This predictive coding influences what you notice, how you interpret events, and what emotional responses you attach to them. If the pattern of repeated speech is consistently positive, the brain starts scanning for confirmation of that pattern in the environment, reinforcing the belief through feedback loops of perception and experience. In addition to reshaping thought patterns, repetition affects the emotional salience of a belief. The amygdala, a brain structure heavily involved in emotion, becomes sensitized to frequently repeated emotional cues. If you speak a statement with conviction and emotion over and over, the amygdala begins to associate that phrase with significance. Emotional intensity acts like a spotlight, directing attention and memory consolidation toward what is being repeated. This is why statements spoken in a passionate or charged tone leave a stronger impression. Over time, the emotional weight of the repeated phrase becomes part of its power. It's no longer just words. It's a trigger for an emotional state that feels real and immediate. The hippocampus, which is essential for forming long-term memories, also plays a role in repetition. Through repeated speech, short-term inputs get encoded into long-term memory, making the statement not just something you say, but something you believe and remember as part of your identity. The more phrases repeated, the more neural resources the brain allocates to it, solidifying it in both episodic memory and semantic memory, the memory of concepts and meaning. This is how spoken repetition begins to bridge the gap between intention and identity. You're not just saying what you want to be true, you're training your brain to remember it as part of who you are. It's important to recognize that repetition works both constructively and destructively. The brain doesn't evaluate the truth or usefulness of a repeated message, it simply responds to frequency and emotional intensity. If someone repeatedly says negative, disempowering things to themselves, the same neural mechanisms will reinforce those beliefs just as powerfully. This underscores the responsibility we have in curating the language we expose ourselves to, especially our own. By consciously choosing empowering, affirming phrases and repeating them consistently, we take control of the programming process. We become the architects of our internal narrative, using repetition as the tool to etch that narrative deeply into the brain's structure. Repetition also facilitates synchronization across different brain networks. For a belief to influence behavior, it must be supported not only by the cognitive system, but also by emotional and motor systems. Repeating a phrase frequently creates coherence between what you think, how you feel, and how you act. The phrase becomes a kind of anchor, aligning the different layers of the self toward a unified direction. This alignment builds internal congruence, which increases clarity, confidence, and action readiness. The more the message is repeated, the stronger the internal synchronization, making it easier to make decisions and take steps that reflect the repeated belief. The effect of repetition is cumulative. One round of affirmation may momentarily boost confidence, but consistent repetition creates lasting transformation. The neural architecture changes, the internal dialogue shifts, the emotional associations deepen. The identity begins to shift from one shaped by default or past programming to one shaped by conscious intention. Through repetition, the spoken word becomes a neural blueprint guiding how you think, feel, and show up in the world. When you speak a phrase with emotional intensity and clear intention, you are not only engaging the cognitive and linguistic centers of the brain, you are also activating the electromagnetic field generated by your body. The human heart and brain emit measurable electromagnetic signals, and these signals fluctuate based on mental and emotional states. The heart, in particular, produces an electromagnetic field that is several thousand times more powerful than that of the brain and can be detected several feet outside the body. This field is not a vague or metaphorical concept, it is a scientifically measurable output that interacts with the nervous system, the brain, and even the fields of others around you. When you combine emotionally charged repetition of affirmations with coherence in your body's physiological rhythms, such as breath and heart rate, you begin to influence this field in a stable and focused way. Studies from the field of neurocardiology and psychophysiology, particularly those involving heart-brain coherence, show that when a person enters a state of emotional alignment such as gratitude, love, or deep belief, their heart rate variability becomes smooth and ordered. This coherence sends signals to the brain that improve emotional regulation, increase clarity, and create a state of synchronized functioning between cognitive and emotional centers. When you speak affirmations while in this state, the message is encoded more powerfully across both brain and body. The coherence between physiological systems creates a kind of broadcast signal that amplifies the internal message, creating stronger internal resonance and greater alignment across all systems of perception and action. From a systems biology perspective, this alignment also influences hormonal balance. Repeated affirmations, when spoken with conviction, can reduce stress hormones such as cortisol and increase neurochemicals like oxytocin and serotonin. These hormones are not just mood regulators, they also influence immune function, energy levels, and social perception. A body flooded with stress hormones processes information through a threat-focused lens, but a body in a balanced neurochemical state is more open to opportunities, better able to connect with others, and more responsive to new ideas. By creating this biochemical environment through repeated and emotionally charged speech, you optimize your internal state for growth and transformation. Your biology becomes receptive to the vision you are affirming, allowing that vision to take root and influence your behavior more organically. Beyond the internal, the electromagnetic signals generated by your body may also interact with the people and environments around you. Though this area of science is still evolving, there is growing evidence that emotional states, especially when stabilized and coherent, can influence group dynamics, social interactions, and even the performance of teams or collectives. Your internal coherence, expressed through voice, body language, and subtle energetic cues, becomes a kind of signal that others can feel. People may not consciously detect your field, but they respond to it. They feel drawn to certainty, to confidence, to authenticity. And when your spoken affirmations reflect genuine emotional alignment, the strength of your signal increases. This is how personal alignment begins to influence relational and social outcomes. You don't just think differently, you start to impact the world around you differently. Another dimension of this process is resonance. In physics, resonance occurs when one object vibrating at a certain frequency causes another object to vibrate at the same frequency. In a psychological or energetic sense, the same principle applies to repeated affirmations. When you repeat a statement often enough, it begins to create a mental frequency, a baseline vibration of thought and